Hi, I'm Tori Crone with Proactive Therapy,
And I'm Lyndon Lawson, a clinician at Proactive Therapy.
and we're here today to talk to you guys about some of what's going on during the time of COVID-19 and trying to bring you some tips and tools that might be helpful for you today. So, Lyndon, let's start by tell me what's been happening for your clients this week, what's been going on, what's coming up in your sessions.
It's interesting, there seems to be a theme in all of my sessions this week that people are starting to come in with just a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Uncertainty about the future, how long this is going to go on, what does that look like? People are starting to have uncertainty about their own health. And so I think that's just been a theme this week as we've been doing this almost 2 months now, and people are starting to kind of feel that this has been going on a while and they're kind of coming to grips with how long might this be happening.
Right. This is such an uncertain time. It seems like everything is uncertain, and we haven't always had to face as much uncertainty in our modern times as we are right now.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to normalize for everybody too that it is normal to be afraid of uncertainty. I mean, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, an example that comes from Kelly Wilson, who I think just explains this beautifully. He talks about, if you can kind of imagine our caveman ancestors out in the wilderness looking for lunch, and that caveman sees a shape in the distance that they can't quite make out. Maybe it's a blueberry bush, maybe it's a bear, we're not quite sure. Our ancestors that erred on the side of caution, that decided that uncertainty was dangerous, that it could be a bear, and who avoided the situation, those were the ones that were more likely to survive and pass their DNA on to the next generation. So if you think about it, we are the product of generation after generation after generation of people who survived because they learned to fear uncertainty.
Really
the ancestors that decided it was better to skip lunch than be lunch were the ones that survived.
Right. So it kept them alive.
Absolutely. And it's still with us today. It's natural to be afraid of uncertainty.
Sure. And yet we know that a lot of times when we really get caught up in uncertainty, we can do things that are ineffective and end up not helping us to actually cope any better with uncertainty.
Yeah, we tend to struggle with it, which can actually make the problem bigger. Are you seeing that with any of your clients right now, kind of starting to struggle and resist this uncertainty?
Yeah, there's so much. A lot of it's around job issues, like will I be furloughed? Will I lose my job? Of course, the biggest one I think for everyone to some extent is, will I get sick or will my family get sick from this? And there are certain things we can do that are within our control to try and help mitigate that risk. Of course, washing our hands and all the things that we're being told by the CDC, but beyond that, there's not too much that we can do besides social distancing.
Right, but that's uncomfortable for people. And then I think we want some sense of control so people can start to get control by, ruminating, thinking again and again and running through scenarios, becoming hyper vigilant about any symptom they're feeling in their body, which can just lead to a cascade of catastrophic thinking. People go online and start to research symptoms of COVID. They go on WebMD. They rewatch the news to see kind of what they can glean about the risks and what might be happening in their own bodies. I mean, you can see how this uncertainty, as soon as we start to fight with it and try to get control over it, it just balloons into taking up our entire lives.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, what's the problem with trying to gain some control over things that are uncertain? What's wrong with that?
I mean, I think it's a natural thing for all of us to try to do. We all want control, and if there's control to be gained, great. But in this case, there really just isn't. And so I think what a lot of people will find, and I find this when I resist uncertainty, you just start expending so much effort and energy struggling with this uncertainty, researching, ruminating, obsessing, that nothing's actually changing or becoming more certain, but it just starts to take up our whole world. Our whole day becomes consumed with fighting this uncertainty instead of spending our time doing something that feels rich and meaningful.
Sure. Yeah. So another example would be a client who goes to the doctor several times throughout this period. And they might actually put themselves at risk more by going to the doctor right now than if they had stayed home and tried to, wait it out or something. But they're so fearful of, what if I have this? And there's not that much they could do even if they did find out that they had a diagnosis. But some people are so bent on finding out, like, I have to find out if I have this.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have kind of this saying in DBT that pain times resistance equals suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that equation, essentially what it means is pain, like uncertainty, it happens from time to time, right? I mean, that's just a natural part of life. But the more that we resist it, I don't like this, I don't want this, I can't stand this, I need to research this, I need to get control over this, the more that it takes that pain and just amplifies it into suffering. And so the concept here is that, pain is part of life, pain can't be avoided, but suffering is optional. The degree to which we resist determines how much we're gonna blow that pain up into suffering.
So true, so true. And on the flip side, the Buddhist tradition is really an understanding that things are always uncertain. And I think they have a really deep appreciation for impermanence and recognizing that we're all going to die one day. Things that are outside of our control are going to happen to us all the time. And so we need to really lean into to living fully while we can. And in that tradition, I think there's just the complete opposite of what you were describing. Like, there's a real richness of acceptance, and not all of this willfulness. They're kind of wanting more and more control.
Sounds
There's
freeing
a couple
the way that you describe it. It sounds freeing the way that you describe it.
It does. I think it's very liberating, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are a couple quotes that I wanted to read from a philosopher that have sort of a Buddhist tradition or Buddhist slant to them. So these are by Martha Nussbaum. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but hopefully I am. To be a good human, she says, to be a good human being is to have a kind of openness to the world, an ability to trust uncertain things beyond your own control that can lead you to be shattered in very extreme circumstances for which you were not to blame. That says something very important about the human condition of the ethical life, that it is based on a trust in the uncertain and on a willingness to be exposed. It's based on being more like a plant than like a jewel, something rather fragile, but whose very particular beauty is inseparable from its fragility.
I really like that image of the plant versus the jewel. I haven't heard that before, but when you describe that, at least my reaction is, you think about the jewel and you think about it as being kind of like rigid and ingrained and static, and the plant, while being more fragile, that there's growth there, there's risk, there's reward, there's kind of all of those beautiful things that we think of when we think about the meaning of being human. What makes that special?
Exactly. So the rest of her quote is, the paradox of the human condition is that our capacity for vulnerability may be what allows for tragedy to befall us. The greatest tragedy of all is the attempt to guard against hurt by petrifying that essential softness of the soul, for that denies our basic humanity. So the idea there being that what makes us vulnerable is what makes us beautiful and what makes our lives beautiful too. And if we organize our lives around trying to reduce or mitigate any kind of risk or to avoid any uncertainty, then our lives become really, really small and narrow. And an example of this is some of the clients we've worked with who are afraid of flying, and really valid fear. Like, bad, scary things can happen if you're on an airplane and you're trusting your life to somebody else and to technology. And so if we decide that we're not going to fly, then there are a lot of things that we might miss out on. We might miss out on going to a wedding of somebody that we love. We might miss out on wonderful vacations overseas or adventures. And so we really want to work on kind of leaning into uncertainty, as scary as it is, in order to make our lives bigger and fuller.
I think that's so true. And I think even in the pandemic, that's a lot of what I'm hearing from my clients. And on certain days where I've struggled with uncertainty, it's something that I've felt too, that when I'm in the struggle with uncertainty, that things just become very kind of stuck and frozen. They start to feel like Groundhog Day. They start to feel repetitive. There is no fluidity. There is no openness. There is no, value to action, joy that, when we can acknowledge the uncertainty and we can come back to, and what do I want to be about in this moment? It's liberating. It's, versus how do I avoid my anxiety, it just feels like a trap. It feels stuck and repetitive. So I love this jewel versus plant, and kind of thinking about the fluidity of the plant versus the rigid and stuckness of the jewel.
Right.
Right.
So what would be the antidote to kind of stomping our feet in the face of uncertainty?
I think the antidote a lot of times is willingness. I mean, you kind of supplied that word willfulness early on, that sometimes we kind of become rigid and willful towards things that we fear. And I think it's a shift into being willing to be with that uncertainty and decide how we want to be in this moment. I acknowledge, though, that's a lot easier said than done, right? I think a lot of us intuitively know that a willing response is oftentimes effective. And it's hard to figure out how to do that when our nervous system feels that it's really under threat, right? And that's what uncertainty is. It feels like a threat. And so I guess my question for you, Tori, would be, if willingness is the antidote, how can some of our clients who are really feeling threatened and that idea feels really scary, can they do to help them kind of get there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we want to pivot towards willingness. And again, it's important to distinguish. Willingness doesn't mean that you love it or that you like it even. It just means that you recognize that that's the most effective stance towards uncertainty, and that we don't really have another choice. And so it's, in some ways, it's an attitude. And in some ways, we have to focus on mind, body, and spirit in order to kind of cultivate that acceptance or that willing stance. So starting with mind, there are a few tricks, especially in acceptance and commitment therapy, that we use in order to develop a new relationship with our thoughts, because our thoughts are often what can plague us the most. So thoughts like, I can't stand this, or when will this be over? I can't move on until this ends, or I can't have any fun until this ends. And so if we take those thoughts and we can't exactly fight with the thoughts, that's probably not going to be very helpful to say, no, it will be over soon. We're going to end up in this kind of tug of war in our minds. And so rather than getting caught up in arguing against our thoughts, we want to change our relationship to our thoughts. And one way that we can do that in acceptance and commitment therapy, we call this diffusion. And so it's being aware of our thoughts first and foremost, and being able to gain distance from them. So an example would be if I'm having, rather than saying, I can't stand this, I might just put the words before it, I'm having the thought that I can't stand this. It's such a simple, really small change, but it can have a huge impact. It's sort of the same difference between I'm stupid and I'm having the thought that I'm stupid. One takes it as a literal truth, and one just changes the relationship to that thought.
Yeah, so I think that's really powerful. I think about a lot, if I can see a thought as a thought versus seeing it as a literal truth, it becomes possible that thought may or may not be true. That thought may or may not be helpful. I can decide how I want to interact with that thought. There's a lot of power in just naming it for what it is. It's a thought that's arising and falling.
Right. And mindfulness is the best way to really practice this skill. Another example would be if you closed your eyes and you imagined being close to a stream, you could imagine putting each of your thoughts that were bringing you some distress, you could put them on a leaf and watch the leaf go down the stream. But you'd be doing it with all your thoughts. So we're not picking and choosing which thoughts we like and which ones we want to send down the stream. We're just saying, what am I having for lunch? Put that thought on a leaf. I can't stand this. Put that thought on a leaf. And we're just visualizing the leaves going down the stream, kind of gently moving away. And that's another example of a way to practice diffusion.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that does a lot to change our relationship to our thoughts. And
Right.
you talked about this importance of when we're trying to pivot towards willingness to do it with mind, body, and spirit. And I think that's a great way to address the mental piece of it.
Hmm.
As far as the body and the
Yeah.
spirit, one of the tricks that I love that comes from DBT is called half smile
Hmm.
and willing hands.
What do
Um,
you do?
so basically, the idea is our emotions are partially controlled by the way that we posture
Hmm.
ourselves. And when we think about feeling threatened and feeling really willful towards uncertainty, it's usually a very kind of tense posture.
Yeah.
And so, what we invite people to do to kind of signal to the nervous system to be more open and willing is to adopt kind of Mona Lisa smile and then have your hands in your lap, palm up towards the ceiling. So essentially, it kind of looks like this. It's not a tense expression. No one else needs to know that you're doing it, but adopting this posture for a couple of minutes can actually help your nervous system start to respond in kind, to be more open
Hmm.
and willing. It's really powerful.
Feels good.
I know it does. It works really well.
Yeah.
And then I think for the spirit piece of things, you can get really creative with involving your spirit.
Uh-huh.
I've had, some clients who like to imagine inhaling resistance and kind of exhaling, inhaling willingness and
That was like
exhaling any
this.
resistance.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I think for some people, prayer can be a way to tap into this. I've
Mhm.
had others that like to be out in nature or look up to the sky and get a sense that, of how big the universe is. And it can sometimes help us kind of contact that we are really not in control of this big thing. And we're just a part of it that needs to kind of be in the flow of our experience versus
Right.
trying to control this large world around us. So
Right.
I really encourage people to get creative with it, to involve diffusion, to
Mhm.
adopt a willing posture, and to think about how, in a spiritual sense, do I want to invite some willingness into my life.
Yeah. I love those ideas. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
and and so when we stop fighting uncertainty, or when we stop fighting our emotions, what ends up happening?
When we stop fighting, a lot of times all these feelings that we've been trying to clamp down against, struggle against, resist, they can start to kind of come to the surface, right? We can start to feel maybe the grief or the fear that we haven't allowed ourselves to feel
Mm.
previously. And it's
Scary.
important to be with that, to
Hmm.
allow those emotions to rise and fall, to pass through us. That's how we start to kind of resolve some of these feelings.
Hmm.
The metaphor I love to use with this is that of a wave. So if you think about a wave that's rising and coming towards you, if you try to stop and resist it, it doesn't work really well, right? You just end up getting kind of clobbered by the wave. And so instead, the way we want to relate to these experiences when they come up is just to kind of surf the wave, to kind of ride on top of them, to let the wave rise and fall. And part of the way that we do this is through mindfulness. It's through noticing moment to moment the physical sensations, the emotions that are coming. And instead of battling them, to just moment to moment kind of describe what's arising, how it's changing. That can help us kind of be with that wave as it rises and eventually resolves.
Right. So it's really the opposite of what we generally do, which kind of comes as second nature, is to resist the emotions when they're uncomfortable, to do everything we can to turn our backs from them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have an acronym that I use often with clients that kind of fits with what you're describing. We call it FACE COVID. And this was an acronym created by Russ Harris, who's an ACT guru, acceptance and commitment therapy practitioner. And so there's really four steps. So we start with the F in face, and that's focusing on what's in our control. So maybe making a list of those things that you do have in your control, the way that I interact with people, my attitude towards a lot of this, how I structure my days, who I keep in touch with and how often, my activities throughout the day. There's a lot that still is in our control. So kind of being mindful of those things and maybe making a list, maybe putting them on Post-its, maybe putting that on your mirror. All of these things are just good reminders of what's in our control. So that's the F. The A is to acknowledge your thoughts and feelings in the moment. So just an awareness of what's coming up, primarily the feelings, really recognizing this is a tough moment for me, or I'm experiencing anxiety. Would you be willing to share, Lyndon, for yourself? What are you feeling in this moment?
I mean, as we're talking about this theme of uncertainty, one of the things that I feel most uncertain about is when am I going to be able to get back to the office and kind of see some of my clients in person? You know, I miss that just real human connection.
Me too.
Um,
Yeah.
and so some of the thoughts that come up for me are, when is this going to happen? Is this going to take a really long time?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the feelings that I notice in my body are kind of anxiety or a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
So it usually feels like heat and kind of buzzing and restlessness in my body is what I typically notice when I get caught up in
Yes.
struggling against uncertainty.
And you're obviously a clinician because you're able to recognize the sensations that come with feelings. But for our clients who aren't as familiar with that, one thing to recognize when you're trying to identify a feeling, you might not have a name for a feeling, but notice what you experience internally, what sensations. So Lyndon described heat. Maybe there's a little feeling in your chest or a tightness or a lump in your throat. Those are all sensations that are often associated with feelings. So we want to just acknowledge those thoughts and feelings. And then the C is to connect with your body. So you want to do something to connect. So I often have people just push their fingertips together and just notice sort of a pulsing feeling, or notice what that contact feels like. You might root your feet into the ground and just really push down and notice what that feels like. You might just roll your shoulders. It's a really simple thing to do, but it's a way to connect with your body. So just some simple things that you can do. And you can be taking your feelings with you while you're doing that. So you might be feeling anxious and rolling your shoulders. So we're not getting rid of the feelings. We're just moving to the next step and taking it with us if it wants to come with us. And
I always
then,
find it really grounding to come into this like world of sensation and just
yeah.
experience something in the here and now. It takes
Mhm.
me out of like my head and into this moment. And so I
Exactly.
love that part of it.
Exactly. And then the E is for engage in the moment. So we want to do something to broaden our awareness outside of just our thoughts and our feelings and kind of re-engage with what's around us. So doing the dishes, doing whatever you're planning to do with your day. Maybe you're deep breathing. Maybe you're doing some exercise or going for a walk, but you're kind of broadening your awareness. And then I recommend that people repeat this a few times to really get comfortable with the process and to keep establishing that and to work on the acceptance of uncertainty. So it's a great tool if you notice that you're caught up in your thoughts, if you're really caught up in a feeling, to practice these 4 steps. So again, it's called Face COVID. If you want to learn more about it, you can Google it. And Russ Harris is, again, the person who developed that acronym.
I love that. I think coming to mindfulness and having a step-by-step procedure of how we go about this does help us feel like we can surf on top of this wave instead of
Yeah.
being consumed by it.
Yeah.
I love having something tangible like that to follow. It helps me feel kind of grounded and that there's a process and there's something to trust as we open ourselves up to some of these difficult feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's all we've got for today and all that we have time for. If anyone has any ideas of things they're struggling with that they want us to address in future videos, feel free to email either of us. You can email me at Tory, Tory, at proactive-therapy.com. And we are clinicians with a psychotherapy outpatient practice in Chicago. And we are offering telehealth sessions for the time being. So we'd love to help whoever's struggling. Thanks for being here today, Lyndon.
Yeah,
Chatting.
thanks for talking with me as well. It's always helpful to kind of just refocus on what's important. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Sounds good. Thanks. You too.